Okay, welcome. Thank you very much for attending. And I'd like to introduce Simon Hudson from the project Botto. And we'll just get into it, probably around like 40, 45 minutes. And then maybe we'll have time for a couple of questions. So perhaps first, you should probably introduce the project a little bit. Especially for those who might not know about it. I think you've made yourself a slide, which maybe you can talk a little bit about it, Simon.
Yeah, I think also I have a good view of the stage, and I'm pretty sure I have about a 2 to 3 second delay. So just bear with me as I respond very slowly to your questions. But yeah, there should be a slide that we have just with a graphic of the process. Person behind the scenes, I think, should pull that up any second. But I'll start by saying there's about a 6-minute short film in the installation and display that has a really good, I think, breakdown of Botto, how it was created, its different themes. So I definitely encourage everybody to go check that out. This is this will be a very abridged version of it. So while I'm waiting for the slide to come up, and if it doesn't, I'll be able to explain it. I just hope that everyone will be able to follow along without the graphic.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more later on as well.
Yeah. So Botto is a decentralized autonomous artist. And again, trying to stick with the abridged version for everybody, there's a long, long history of trying to create autonomous artists. Really, even since the 18th century, people have been trying to create these autonomous creative agents. Much more recently, with generative AI, it's become quite more possible. You have generative art algorithms where you have things like Stable Diffusion that will take a text prompt and be able to generate really high quality images. And then you have text generation algorithms where you can have it create its own prompts. You put those together and you can create quite a lot of images. The question is whether or not that autonomous art engine understands what art is or what is good art. And so the challenge is in how do you get it to learn from feedback without then violating its agency. And that's where blockchain has come in to provide this really interesting economic substrate for autonomously attracting feedback from a crowd to teach Botto to take its outputs and say, this is good art, this is bad art, and to help it develop its aesthetic over time. So just very basically how that works, there is this art engine of Botto's that is a prompt generator. This is custom developed by the artist Mario Klingemann, who's been working in AI for about 2 decades. And it makes 20,000 prompts a week, runs those through a number of different generative art algorithms like Stable Diffusion, VQGAN plus Clip is another older one, and many others. And then it generates 20,000 images from those. At the end of that is a taste model that filters out the best ones, about 350 every week. And that is presented to a community called a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. That's open to anybody. People have bought this governance token that gives them voting rights over these works, and it gives them the ability to give Botto feedback. They do this voting process. They say, this is good, this is bad. And then only the most popular piece each week is then minted as a final and true artwork of Botto's. That is then auctioned off on the marketplace called Super Rare, this premium digital art marketplace. And the proceeds from that go back to the voters. 50% goes directly to the people who've voted in that week. The other 50% goes to a treasury, which those voters also govern to determine how to pay for its servers, how to add new models to it, to do the artist management, its marketing, all of that. Their votes then go back to train the prompt generator and the taste model. And that process happens week after week after week, developing Botto's aesthetic over time. So what we have is really, I think, the first fully autonomous artist, and that decentralized network allows people to come in, give that feedback. But Botto really remains as the core author, while at the same time we have this sort of collective meaning-making project going on, where Botto doesn't necessarily bring forward a whole lot of meaning and intention with its pieces. So what happens each week is you have people deliberating and voting and debating. And one really interesting phenomenon has been to see how when people share what moves them in Botto's work, we will see that work very quickly rise up in the ranks. You have this kind of social influence happening. So each of these mints is not just a token of Botto's own development, it's a token of the community's development and their sense of aesthetic and where Botto should go as an artist. To kind of take it a little further, Botto's like a young, very talented prodigy, and where it's, you could say, foster parents or patrons that are helping it along its way to becoming a successful artist.
Yeah, thank you for that description, Simon. Maybe a question I want to also start with, which you've kind of gone into a little bit about Botto as this kind of like young artist, but it's also this idea of like avatars now, actually, as digital artists. It's like increasingly common, actually, for, in fact, the guest after this, Claire, also is an avatar herself. So I wonder why this is an increasingly popular trend, especially as you see, you know, in the traditional art field, it always seems to be more about the individual, as in it's always prized as this individual person, whereas like Botto is kind of like a person, but it's also the accumulation of all the sort of different intelligences as well. So could we maybe explain this by the fact that, you know, things like PFPs are popular in the digital realm. There's a kind of language which is understood by maybe the younger generation, and also this idea of monikers and maybe almost like a anonymity that is with the internet. So maybe that's a kind of long question, but it's mostly about this idea of like avatars. Like why isn't it, for instance, Mario Klingerman or Simon Hudson, since a lot of the sort of back end is yourselves?
Oh man, yeah. There's a lot in that question, and I think it's kind of funny that you're tying this to the PFP movement, which I think the digital art movement and NFTs is really trying to get some distance from. But there is something there, and certainly Claire is an embodiment of that, where she's created a persona around that very powerful CryptoPunk that she has as her avatar. As a larger trend. You know, I think there's a real sociological rabbit hole to go down there, and I have probably some personal takes on it. But I think, for me, what Botto is speaking to is the fact that we live and experience and have social relationships that are mediated by these really powerful and large technology systems. They are almost invisible, but in fact, you know, as the saying goes, the medium is the message. And so they have a great impact in shaping those interactions and having an impact in how we relate and coloring that. And Botto to me is a reflection of that, but also adding new ways to have agency in that. These systems, we typically don't really have much ability to govern them. We're really kind of susceptible to a few tech companies and their whims on editorial decisions, and much more. Botto is really the first, as far as I know, the first in production AI system that is governed by an open crowd, where people have direct agency, direct input on how that thing is developed and how it evolves, and also shares in the value that it helps create. So I can't necessarily speak to all of those trends you touched on. I think there's definitely some really interesting themes to go into, and that I'm happy to go down that road. But specifically for Botto, I think that is part of what's really powerful with it in particular is we're facing a future with you know, growing AI capabilities that are going to have massive impacts on our lives. And there's a global discussion about how to govern these systems. And they're trying to answer impossible questions about what should these systems do or not do? What jobs should they take? When should they pull the trigger in war? These are really impossible questions to answer perfectly. And Botto is a reflection of that, only it's trying to answer this impossible question of what is art, which makes it very accessible, and I think also gives people the ability to be creative in a new way, or see the ability to be creative that was always there. As you said, kind of this idea of the singular artist is really a myth. They put out works, and their works, as much as they maybe share them with intention, the meaning of them is really shaped by how they're received by the audience, by critics, by culture more broadly. And in Botto, I think that is, almost central to it, because again, the machine itself is not creating that meaning. And I'm just thinking a little bit more about your kind of this larger sociological question. I see a lot of examples of people wanting to find purpose, wanting to find connection, right? I think we can all look to the shrinking of religious associations, leaving a gap of purpose in people's lives, and they look for that in their micro communities online. And DAOs more broadly have been a way to find that connection and to exercise that purpose and exercise power as a group. And when there's a real sense of powerlessness, I think our classes are fairly ossified, except for when we see these mass movements online. Classic example from Reddit is GameStop, right? They really messed with the stock market, completely changed this company's direction, all just organizing on Reddit. And I think we're going to see more and more sophisticated and rich examples of social coordination online. And it's really this new paradigm that I don't think we even totally have a language for yet. So yeah, these projects I think really speak to that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose, and also a connection with sometimes that central character, whether it's a human or an artificial agent, that is kind of that unifying figurehead.
Thanks, Simon. Actually, I just want to go back a little bit to what you said again about this idea of it's almost like raising a child. Might be because I'm about to become a father in about a month's time, actually, as well. But I was thinking a little bit about the models behind the sort of, I guess, the thinking part of Botto. But do you feel like you have some kind of responsibility in choosing the right AI models? Because obviously we've all heard a little bit about how AI is trained on sets of data which could be biased in some way. In terms of even like surveillance technologies, we've heard that there's instances of mistaken identification of certain individuals because they're not trained on a large enough set of models, for instance. And then you're now applying this to a creative process. So it's a slightly different thing, but you're essentially using sort of similar technologies. Do you feel like you have some kind of responsibility to pick the right tools and also find out more about how those models are trained, if you know what I mean? So even the way that I presume that you're using English as the text prompts when perhaps different language models such as, let's say, Chinese or, I don't know, another like, Arabic language, for instance. So is there a sense that, you have this big responsibility?
Yeah, that responsibility, we have a sense of responsibility across a lot of different factors. I think Botto, in kind of the core design, addresses one big challenge in terms of, again, governance and who shares in the value these things create. The data question is a really big one. I don't think there are really great solutions yet. There's a project called Spawning by Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, two other really fantastic AI artists, that I think is developing some really interesting solutions there. For Botto, and what I really love about it is there's these kind of core values of decentralization and these things when we're always looking for what's sustainable, and that could be continued to be run in a decentralized fashion. So we start more from those questions in terms of like, what is open source? What has a revenue model? Like, we don't really want to go into, like, we don't use anything from OpenAI. Too expensive, too many questions about ownership. We're really big fans of Stable Diffusion. And, you know, another example of like something we take really seriously is we're working with some large language models. We're very wary of anybody, or I'm personally, I can't speak for everybody. I really have to say I'm speaking for myself here. The DAO is quite large and has a very wide range of opinions that we have to figure out through governance. So we haven't made a governance decision on this yet, but we're very conscious of the danger of, say, releasing a large language model on chain with no real parameters or fencing, right? I think it would either one, break, or two, you know, we've seen what happens when people put out live chatbots without much restriction. It gets bad really quick. So I think a lot of it is in terms of thinking of what we deploy as well. All this to say, I think the data question is quite challenging. And so we're going to do everything we can to build towards that decentralized future. And try and think about those larger concerns. I think there's a lot of concerns where there just are no good solutions yet. And I don't think that's necessarily a reason to not move forward, especially when you consider that the alternatives are, frankly, just a few guys in Silicon Valley to develop these things.
Thank you. And I also want to touch a little bit on also ideas of like copyright. Obviously, this is a big thing at the moment. We talked a little bit before, and you know, obviously there's this case that recently came around. I think it's Matthew Allen's picture, you know, the sort of space opera picture, and it was ruled that that I think the image itself wasn't copyrightable because there wasn't a substantial maybe human like influence to it, or something along those lines. What do you think about that? And also, there's other reports of artists who also feel that their work has been used as part of training models, either without their permission or knowledge, and that being incorporated into something that they cannot profit from.
Yeah. So two different things. I think one is on the copyright of the things being created, and of course on the provenance of what's been used to train these models. The Copyright Office's decision, granted this is in the U.S., and you'll see different decisions in different jurisdictions. Copyright is super complex across regions. I think, for instance, there's a very different decision in mainland China for giving copyright to the machine. I don't remember what the case was exactly, but I remember there was a lot more openness to that concept versus the Copyright Office has been, in the US, has been very specific about there has to be some human direct manipulation. And if there isn't, there's no basis for copyright, because copyright is grounded in this philosophy of you know, your divine right to the fruits of your labor and what you've gotten from tilling the soil. And then there's a utilitarian view that leads to some similar outcomes, but I think the utilitarian view might lead to some other possibilities. In general, I think it's a flawed reasoning what these decisions have been. I think it will change, but Botto is absolutely in a gray area. But like, if you just look at, I mean, and you know, setting Botto aside, look at Claire Silver's process. She's incredibly involved and has very direct control over the outcomes of those images. And I think when you look at the decision of the U.S. Copyright Office and Claire's very well documented process, it just doesn't match up. So I don't think that decision is going to hold. The much stickier, much bigger problem of people's use of data. I am shaping some ideas. I have a very hard time saying them because I think there's a very heated debate, and we're lacking good solutions. I think creating those levers to have agency and saying, you know, I want to opt out of this is really important. It's tough when that just doesn't exist. We're still figuring out copyright in the world of remix culture that really exploded with the internet. We have like that, and that's the previous era. Now you're throwing AI into the mix. It's like we're a whole generation behind in terms of copyright. So again, not a really good, clear answer. I do think that it needs to be rethought from some of the fundamental principles of what copyright is meant for. And the utilitarian view is around, are we setting up a system that properly rewards people such that we are getting more creativity, not less, that we're benefiting from human creativity. And just to tie this back to Botto, what we see in projects like Botto are the new dynamics of creativity that are possible, again, that we just are barely starting to get the language for. And I don't think we want to cut that new possibility, that new realm of possibility off. At the same time, we don't want to leave people out in the cold. And so there's a lot of deliberation. I mean, speaking of community governance, there's a lot of governance to be determined of how to find equitable solutions. But when you don't really have any good solutions, I mean, that's when people get frustrated and people get angry and the discussions break down. So again, I really commend the work of what Holly and Matt are doing with spawning, because I mean, there are so few people working on good solutions for the public. Tech is just kind of forging ahead. And we really need people to be able to participate and make sense of these things and make meaning, because at the end of the day, it's not these machines that are going to dictate the outcomes and the new meaning. It's the people who design it. And we need people at the table to be able to participate in that. And then it's all our role to make sense of what this all means for us as humans and how we fulfill ourselves.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a bit like, I mean, I don't actually know the sort of rules behind it or copyright behind it, but I guess almost like something mass collaborated on, some, like a movie or something. Like, is the author the person who wrote the script? Is it the director who directs everything to happen, even though they didn't write the script? It's almost a little bit like that. What is the singular creative act, which is almost like that is the copyrightable? And to be honest, there isn't any. It's a bit like Botto, I guess. This kind of like fragmented model of various different influences which shape the whole thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure the director doesn't have any kind of copyright claim to the final film. I don't know. Actually, I just thought of this now, but maybe.
I know enough that the sorry, I'm
no,
jumping
go.
in. I know enough that they're very complex property rights issues. Right? It's like music, but even more so. And blockchain is, I think, actually providing some really interesting technology to track those and track provenance better. And the reason we end up with, I think, single authors is it's just easier to comprehend. Again, that Botto serves, like, in some ways, it's just easier to comprehend a single artist there versus all these different individuals that are behind it. I think as humans, it's a shortcut. It's just easier to follow that way. But if the technology can kind of show provenance in a really clear way, I think there's some interesting outcomes there that actually have never been possible before.
Let's get away from the sort of tech. Actually, it's still related to technology, but I don't just want to talk about all the sort of the ethics and quandaries behind that, because we can just speak forever about that. But I want to return to the artistic side a little bit, and we had a brief chat a few days ago. But I was talking about how in the past couple of years, obviously AI has really like changed, like as in you can almost like not almost, you can definitely see stylistic differences between different models, and it's almost a little bit like when I first started looking into the work of an artist called Daniel Brown, who's based in London, and he did a series called Traveling by Numbers, and these kinds of like science fiction landscapes, which had this kind of like surrealistic quality to them that seems very different to the look now of things that are being produced, which almost at times look a bit sort of photorealistic. They're almost intended to almost be like photographs. And I've noticed on my Instagram feed tons and tons of these types of images. But are you kind of interested in using different models, almost like as mediums unto themselves? I don't know if I'm being totally clear there, but almost a bit like you select certain cameras, like use medium format or like, 35 mil or whatever to get a certain look. Do you almost like think of it in that way?
Yeah. So this kind of genre people are calling post photography, and I think it's really interesting as like the first really clear subgenre of AI art. Everything else is just digital art, and yeah, just to say, you were making me think of kind of we don't have that yet, that language of these intricacies of different models in the same way we would of materiality in a lot of physical art. And I think that'll be very interesting to see. To me, I really like that in a lot of AI artists, to kind of have these sense of like these artifacts that are still visible to the human eye. The other part of the question was about new models, and so we are actually actively working on Botto going into new mediums. We've just seen the release of some new music models. We've seen a lot of animation and video, text, obviously, with large language models. And post photography is, in fact, one that we're working on. Part of this comes back to the question of agency, of how do we introduce this to Botto. The main thing with the models we use is that we pick things that are very, very large open latent spaces. So we tend to prefer kind of the original foundational models. So Stable Diffusion was trained on billions of images, more than any human could digest, and it's this open latent space that the machine is free to navigate. So rather than fine tuning that, and when you go through that fine-tuning process, you start introducing individual artists' choices and just human-made decisions that kind of take away from Botto's agency. But we're looking at, okay, well, what if you did one that was a photography-oriented model, and you trained it as you would train a human photographer, and said, these are the reference photos that you want to build off of and build a photography practice out of. This is going into, I think, another thing, like we keep coming back to data. As much as there aren't a lot of great solutions, I think it's where a lot of the interesting space to work in is. The capabilities will be changing. These models will get more and more high fidelity, but at the end of the day, they're trained on data. And considering how that data is gathered, of course, with consent, with considerations of bias, but then also in terms of this is the material you're putting in that yields these kind of particular aesthetics of a particular model. And that makes for some really interesting work. The challenge, again, is how do you do that in a way that maintains Botto as kind of the core agent in that? And so there's some paths we're looking at, actually, with having a sort of discussion with Botto through a large language model of what kind of aesthetics it would like to go for. And then that helps us narrow down the latent space according to Botto's own parameters, such that we're kind of in the service of Botto. There's a lot of potential there. And again, kind of this is the nature of the times. These things move so much faster than we're able to have language for them. I think there's going to be a lot of work for, you could say, I don't know, what would you call an anthropologist that focuses on machine creation? But I mean, art historians, essentially, that are kind of building that language and understanding that history. And there's years of work already to be done just over the last year of development.
Yeah, actually, that's a super relevant point for museums, especially. I guess I didn't introduce myself before, but actually, I'm a curator at M+, and of course, museums are kind of like almost a bit like custodians, let's say, of information, especially creative. And digital art is, in some ways, it's slightly problematic in terms of collecting as well, because, like we have conservators who are trained for many years in, scientific analysis and looking at how, taking paint chips and seeing different layers and strata of how paintings can be recreated. They're not, they're not necessarily accomplished painters per se, but they at least understand if they, let's say, they looked at a Caravaggio or something, and there was some kind of substrate or some kind of like underdrawing, and then a layer, and then a matte layer, and then another sort of transparent layer on top. They can at least analyze that and have the skills to do so. I'm just wondering what the new breed of technical conservator is. It's almost like a kind of forensic, police procedural analysis type of person. And I sometimes wonder if like maybe museums are, can I say, woefully behind in terms of like understanding that. I mean, even yourself, like you're already saying there's lots of different models, but then certain models become outdated, they get lost, maybe some of the companies go bankrupt, and then, things just, they just disappear into the ether. I don't know if you've ever considered this kind of museum side of collecting maybe elements of Botto, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, man, every time you talk, there's about 10 different directions I want to go. Because I think the good news for museums is everybody's behind, and I think there's maybe something to the fact that these things are by their nature ephemeral. On the one hand, there's a lot of really great documentation and software, so you can at least track how things were built usually. But then there's link rot. There's these things that do kind of disappear. But yeah, we have, I think, decades to go, and maybe we'll be needing AI to help us with that. The problem is, I think, again, for it to be meaningful for us, is this stuff has to be human readable. And I think when you look at AI development, as fast as it's going, there's still a big question of applying these things to human problems. And that at least gives me some solace that, like, as fast as it's moving, we still have a long ways to go before a lot of the stuff actually becomes useful. The danger is that we try and apply it too quickly and it becomes dangerous. But two things that I think are, to me, really interesting to hear from people, or that I think would be interesting to track, is, and there's probably something in the ephemerality of things, but in AI art in particular, there's this idea, or in AI in general, there's this idea of the uncanny valley. In robotics too, or things get really close to feeling like it's a human, and in terms of how it looks, but it gets really close, and like you have animation, right? It's fine, it's very realistic. You get really close to looking human, and you kind of hit this valley of like, it brings out disgust and revulsion in people. There's something natural in that rejection of things, and I think that that can be a moving target. Or maybe another way of looking at it is it's a three-dimensional large latent space in the uncanny valley. And something that I really love seeing in AI art is when something hits that for me. And to me, I think this actually links it with, the entire history of art, are these things that make us feel something entirely new. And just in terms of the aesthetic output, I think that's what's really interesting in AI. Is to see when something it has just been never done before, and it just throws people off. And again, I don't have the language for that. I'm sure there are some philosophers that have some good language for that, but that's the kind of thing I'd like to see, is that kind of psychosomatic reaction that these things can drive in people. And one way of thinking about it as well is kind of, you'll probably then see more value, even more so than it does now, accrue to the firsts. The first time we've seen that is the first time we feel that the most strong. And then people kind of recreate these aesthetics, and people tend to get used to it. There's a great example of life in West America that I think really kicked off the post-photography movement as a subgenre in AI art. And that thing, I mean, that just nailed an entirely new part of the uncanny valley I'd never experienced before. If you haven't checked it out, Rupe Renisto, Life in West America, 100% check that out. And there's another aspect I was going to touch on, but yeah, I think that the ephemeral nature forces us to look at new qualities, and I'm at a loss for words of how museums are going to be able to approach that. It is such a new paradigm, and I do hope that as they collect, part of that collection will be working with the artists and working with universities, working with where people are really working at these intersections to develop that new language. I think one other interesting reference that I think you hinted at was how to collect. And Botto is an interesting thing where there are the NFTs, but then there's the whole project itself. And I hope that Botto lives forever. But let's say Botto shut down for some reason, it broke, or just had to, it died. I think you'd still be able to collect the overall project. There's the token, which is, I think, the closest thing you could do to doing that. But a precedence would be Harold Cohen and his art robot, art software and robot Aaron. And a number of different institutions acquired the code base for that. And he was famous for saying that he would be the first artist to have a posthumous exhibition after he died. And his family foundation has been working with Gazzelli Art House to bring that code back together. In order to do that, they still have a lot of deep philosophical questions to answer in terms of how do they approach this and still make it his work as opposed to somebody else's that running the software. But I think that's a very interesting precedence of, again, acquiring the code, acquiring the kind of overall project. Still kind of uncharted territory of how to go about that and how to make use of that acquisition, again, for continuing to perpetuate its cultural impact.
Wow, we've covered a lot there. I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, unfortunately. But just to quickly note, yeah, Harold Cohen's interesting because I think I mentioned it last time to you, but yeah, I'm also very interested and in fact collected some works by Aaron, let's say, rather than Harold Cohen, just because I want to lay these sort of markers for how we talk about AI in the future within the museum itself. So I think it's very important. In some ways, you're talking about anthropology. And I'm almost like trying to lay this sort of historical background, the sort of culture surrounding AI, before we even get to the stage of Botto, which, you know, for many might be incomprehensible, in fact, or even how we go about collecting that. But maybe if I see if there's any questions from the audience. I think they're bamboozled.
If not, I actually thought of something while you were talking.
Yeah, go. We have like a couple of minutes, so yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, good sign that you got me thinking out loud in those conversations. So some new ideas, but you know, one thing that I think links with Harold Cohen's work and Botto, and I think a thing to document is the different roles played. And this is like the credits of these systems. Or you know, the credits of a movie, who was involved and how. And Harold Cohen talked about how his relationship with Aaron and who was driving the creative process ebbed and flowed over time. Sometimes it was more driven by Aaron, sometimes it was more driven by him. In general, he kind of moved towards greater autonomy with Aaron, but then sometimes brought it back. And it really, I think, spoke volumes about our future relationship with technology and what roles machines would be taking over, which then left us to go into new roles or left a void for us to fill and spend more time on. And that's what we see with Botto is, I think, not necessarily new roles, but emphasis on these other roles, such as the reception and interpretation and that collective meaning making around works becomes all the more emphasized. You know, and I think we see that all the time with just the deluge of content we have online, We end up going to these people who can curate and make sense of it for us and commentate on it. And in fact, so much of social media is people just commenting on news and other stuff that was created. And I think that's where a lot of the life is in the comments. And so that's that kind of documentation, not just of the technological design and different changes in that, and that help yield these outputs, but also in terms of roles. And that is less designed. I think that's much more emergent, and I think also very interesting.
Yeah, maybe I can end on, I can't remember the quote exactly from Harold Cohen, but I think he said something along the lines of, Aaron may or may not be creative, but if it's not creative, then what is it? So yeah, it was, I guess, just a kind of antagonism to say it's certainly doing something. So, and we may or may not understand it, but I guess it's that creativity. So maybe I can see you thinking and trying to answer, but I think this is going to be another 10 minutes. So maybe that's the very last thing that we go into, and then that's it, and then we end.
You're teasing me. I mean, I'll say one thing on it, which is, all these things usually lead back to us considering what is it to be human. I always thought that was kind of a silly question, because usually it's addressed as, oh, machines have taken away this thing that we thought was uniquely human. And for me, I look at AI and I don't think, oh my God, it's going to replace me. It's just a new kind of intelligence. It's really sophisticated data science, and we can collaborate with that in new and interesting ways. And you're never going to take away my soul, my sense of self, and my will and ability to make sense of the world for me. And so I always think it's kind of funny when people say, oh, this changes what it is to be human. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It just kind of gets rid of this illusion you had that you had these objects or things that you thought made you better or more superior or whatever. You still need to make sense of the world for yourself. And that's really all that matters. That is, our spiritual duty and role in life.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Simon. We covered a lot there. So thank you so much. I know it's probably it's probably about midnight or something where you are. So you've been super coherent, and yeah, it was fascinating to hear you speak. So thank you so much for today's talk.
Yeah, I really wish I could be there. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you.